Dialectical self-consciousness thus experiences in the flux of all that would stand before it its own freedom as given and preserved by itself. It is aware of this stoical indifference of a thinking which thinks itself the unchanging and genuine certainty of itself. This self-certainty does not issue from something alien whose complex development was deposited within it, a result which would leave behind it the process of its coming to be. On the contrary, consciousness itself is the absolute dialectical unrest, this medley of sensuous and intellectual representations whose differences coincide and whose identity is equally again dissolved, for it is itself determinateness as contrasted with the non-identical. But it is just in this process that this consciousness, instead of being self-identical, is in fact nothing but a purely causal, confused medley, the dizziness of a perpetually self-engendered disorder. It is itself aware of this, for it self-maintains and creates this restless confusion. Hence, it also admits to it owns to being a wholly contingent, single, and separate consciousness, a consciousness which is empirical, which takes its guidance from what has no reality for it, which obeys what is for it not an essential being, which does those things and brings to realization what it knows has no truth for it. But equally, while it takes itself in this way to be a single and separate, contingent, and in fact animal life, and a lost self-consciousness, it also, on the contrary, converts itself again into a consciousness that is universal and self-identical. For it is the negativity of all singularity and all difference. From this self-identity, or within its own self, it falls back again into the former contingency and confusion. For this same spontaneous negativity has to do solely with what is single and separate, and occupies itself with what is contingent. This consciousness is therefore the unconscious, thoughtless rambling which passes back and forth from the one extreme of self-identical self-consciousness to the other extreme of the contingent consciousness that is both bewildered and bewildering. It does not itself bring these two thoughts of itself together. At one time it recognizes that its freedom lies in rising above all the confusion and contingency of existence, and at another time equally admits to a relapse into occupying itself with what is unessential. It lets the unessential content in its thinking vanish, but just in doing so, it is the consciousness of something unessential. It pronounces an absolute vanishing, but the pronouncement is, and this consciousness is the vanishing that is pronounced. It affirms the nullity of seeing, hearing, etc., yet it is itself seeing, hearing, and so forth. It affirms the nullity of ethical principles and lets its conduct be governed by these very principles. Its deeds and its words always belie one another, and equally it has itself the doubly contradictory consciousness of unchangeableness and sameness, and of utter contingency and non-identity with itself. But it keeps the poles of this its self-contradiction apart and adopts the same attitude to it as it does in its purely negative activity in general. Point out likeness or identity to it, and it will point out unlikeness or non-identity. And when it is now confronted with what it has just asserted, it turns round and points out likeness or identity. Its talk is in fact like the squabbling of self-willed children, one of whom says A if the other says B, and in turn says B if the other says A, and who by contradicting themselves buy for themselves the pleasure of continually contradicting one another. In this long paragraph, number 205, what we're seeing is the truth of skepticism being played out. And we're going to find out that skepticism by itself cannot provide a stable ending point for the development of self-consciousness. As a matter of fact, immediately after this, we're going to see the emergence of a new shape of consciousness that you'll see quite soon, so I'm not going to talk about it here. Why are we talking about the truth of self-consciousness, the truth of skepticism? Well, keep in mind that skepticism itself was radicalizing the moment, the development of freedom that was happening with Stoicism. Stoicism didn't go quite far enough. Skepticism is in a certain way being more consistent, more consequential. But what we're going to see in this paragraph is that there is an inherent inconsistency, a contradictoriness to skepticism itself. And not just in the sense of these conundrums like, the liar's paradox, or, if we're going to be skeptical about being skeptical itself. Hegel could have brought that sort of stuff up at this point, but he's not. Instead, he's focusing on the role that empirical contingent consciousness is going to play and why that is going to lead to a contradiction. So let's see where he starts. He says, the skeptical self-consciousness experiences, remember we had the stress on experience and why that's important earlier on in self-consciousness. The experiences in the flux, the fluidity, the shifting, the non-ability to stay fixed. Experiences in the flux of what would stand against it, what would present itself as being essential, what would present itself as being something that consciousness cannot do away with. It experiences its own freedom. And how does it experience its freedom? Precisely by telling these things over here, you're not essential. Whether it's the other understood as the other human being, or the other understood in terms of a body of thought that's been provided by Plato, or the Stoics, or whoever, or the world, or life. All of this ends up being just a kind of, formless, shapeless, empirical flux. Nothing can be taken for granted, because anything could change at any moment. This might make you think of David Hume as well, and his emphasis on contingency. So he says, it experiences its own freedom as given and preserved by itself. So it has its freedom in negating the outside world. And we saw that this, is part of the way that skepticism works. We also saw that there's a kind of reflexive moment to this, where it's becoming conscious of its own freedom. This is a very important development. But now we're going to see that it doesn't remain consequent to itself. In a certain way, Stoicism was more consistent than skepticism was, and that's part of why Stoicism couldn't go as far. So he says, this self-certainty does not issue from something alien, whose complex development was deposited within it. It's becoming conscious of the fact that consciousness itself is working within inside of itself to make this possible. The Stoics were able to grasp this in terms of an eternal logos, in terms of something that wouldn't be individuated necessarily, but takes place within this particular individual. For the skeptic, this becomes even more pressing as a conflict, as we're going to see as the paragraph proceeds, between the empirical and the universal within the person, within the individual, him or herself. So he says, on the contrary, consciousness itself is the absolute dialectical unrest. What kind of unrest? An unrest out here in the world? No. A dialectical unrest here inside of consciousness itself. This medley of sensuous and intellectual representations whose differences coincide, whose identity is equally dissolved, for it is itself determinateness is contrasted with the non-identical. Everything that we are experiencing of the world, we are grasping in terms of thought. You remember that skepticism and Stoicism had this emphasis on the fact that the world is for us, right? It is in our thought. And the contingency, the flux of the world takes place within our own thought, and we're not able to unify it the way that we would like to. This is what the skeptic is actually experiencing by virtue of being a skeptic. He says it's just in this process that this consciousness, instead of being self-identical, is in fact nothing but a purely casual, confused medley. There's a little bit more to that sentence, but let's pause on that. The skeptic becomes aware of the fact that it's not just the world, or the all, or the totality, that is contradictory, that is confused, that doesn't have some sort of principle of order that runs through the entirety where everything fits into its place, but everything kind of jars against everything else. It's happening within consciousness itself. This is a experience, and this is kind of an endpoint, if you like, of skepticism, because it's not going to be a very comfortable place for the skeptic to inhabit. He calls this then the dizziness of a perpetually self-engendered disorder. That's very important there. This is a self-engendered, this is a self-caused disorder. It's not that the world is screwed up. You know, if you think about Stoicism, Stoicism said, look, you can have calm, things can make sense for you if you put the world at a distance and just focus on your side of things. Focus on the fact that you have desires, that you can control your desires, that you can control the way that you think about things. You don't have to be taken in by the screwed upness of the world. Of course, there's a universal logos running through it, but let's put that aside for a moment. The skeptic doesn't have that anymore, because the skeptic has gone further than the Stoic did. The disorder is happening within consciousness itself. Consciousness possesses a kind of dynamism that introduces chaos within consciousness. Not merely order, not merely consistency. This is the absolute dialectical unrest that Hegel's talking about. So he says, hence, it also admits to it. It owns to being a wholly contingent, single and separate consciousness. A consciousness which is empirical. Now, what does it mean to be empirical? It means that it's something that we can experience. And when you're talking about experiencing a consciousness, we have to be a little bit careful here. We have to think a bit. I can experience my own consciousness in terms of what it is that I am conscious of, including being conscious of myself. The contingent factors of, the fact that I grow a beard and my beard is now white when it used to be reddish and brownish in the past. This tie is a certain age and it has to be tied in a certain way because otherwise it will catch upon itself. All that is our empirical consciousness, that I'm here rather than where you are viewing this right now. Those are empirical matters, right? Those are experiential. I can experience something of your consciousness as well in the way that you comport yourself towards me. Of course, I can't know you perfectly, but hell, I can't even know myself perfectly. And you didn't need philosophers like Hegel to tell you that, because Augustine knew that back then. Only, according to Augustine, only God knows us perfectly. We barely know ourselves, right? But we're conscious of our empirical consciousness. We're conscious of our empirical position, of all the things that we can say about ourselves. We're also conscious of the fact that those things are contingent, that they are not universal, even if we might like them to be so, if we're narcissists. They are not universal, and we can't presume them to stand for consciousness per se, as, the consciousness, qua consciousness for everybody. The fact that I am a 45-year-old male roots me in a certain way of being that being a 20-year-old female may not. The fact of being here in America, of being located now in Milwaukee, as opposed to being on the East Coast. All these things matter, but they only matter so much. How do they matter? That's one of the questions that's coming up here. So we have being aware of oneself as being a consciousness which is empirical. What does that mean in terms of the development of skepticism? It says, being empirical means taking its guidance from what has no reality for it, which is this stuff out here, the empirical world. I am what I am in part because of my connection with the world, and I know myself in part through this crazy flux that doesn't really mean anything. So he says, it takes its guidance from what has no reality for it, which obeys what is for it not an essential being, which does those things and brings to realization what it knows has no truth for it. What is Hegel talking about here? The experience of a lack of essence, the experience of what we call meaninglessness or alienation. when I'm eating, I don't eat breakfast cereal anymore, but I used to love breakfast cereal. So I imagine I'm eating my breakfast cereal, and I think about, what is the meaning of this act right now? Well, it's to feed me, and I enjoy the taste of it. And, with each of these things, we can keep on asking, why? What is the reasons for this? And it always turns out to be contingent. Well, it just happens to be that way. Well, why this way and not that way? That's just the way it is. And what creeps in there is what the existentialists call meaninglessness, or the absurd, or anxiety, or ambiguity, all sorts of things like that. We're like, this doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter at all. There is no meaning here. That is what Hegel views as the experience of unessentiality, of something else being essential, not oneself. That's a kind of alienation from oneself that's going on there. That's going to be a very important factor. So he says, equally, while it takes itself in this way to be a single and separate and contingent, and in fact animal life, and a lost self-consciousness, lost. Well, now what does that mean? What is it lost, or where is it lost? It's lost in what he's going to call the unessential, or a kind of confusion, and what it has lost is the universal. It thought it was getting the universal by negating everything, by being free. In doing so, the universal has slipped away from it. So he goes on and he says, here we go. It also, on the contrary, converts itself again into a consciousness that is universal and self-identical. This is very interesting. Instead of pushing it off into the world to look for it, or into some other self-consciousness, the skeptical self-consciousness has grasped itself as being empirical and therefore, not very good in many respects, but it's also grasped itself as having equally this universal side to it. It can, in fact, stand for everybody. It can speak for everybody. This is the flip side of it, the realization that where I stand does matter, not because of where I am, not because of who I am, but in part because of what I am. That is a human being. That human beingness, we can call it, or the reality of humanity exists right here, just as much as it does right over there in you, or just as much as it does in Hegel. The universal has to become real in order to have its sort of agency, and it's becoming real in the skeptic. So he says, from this self-identity, or within its own self, it falls back into the former contingency and confusion. So it realizes this, but it falls back into this. For the same spontaneous negativity has to do solely with what is single and separate, and occupies itself with what is contingent. Now, why does it do that? Why can't it just remain over here in the universal? Because we have to live a life, because we actually are rooted as individual beings in a whole matrix of relations that are in fact contingent, that are in a certain respect, even their very contingency is contingent. So we can't escape that. And he says, this consciousness is therefore the unconscious, thoughtless rambling, which passes back and forth from the one extreme of self-identical self-consciousness, the universal, to the other extreme of the contingent consciousness that is both bewildered and bewildering. Hegel is dealing with a fundamental issue here that goes, in a certain respect, beyond skepticism. What the hell am I? Why am I here? Do I have any sort of purpose? Should I align myself with what I find myself doing right now? Is that my purpose or the meaning to my life? Or is it something I should be in quest of? I should be questioning the narratives that I'm within, or the classifications, so I can move on to something beyond. You can easily lose yourself in a kind of bewilderment, as he's calling this, a confusion. And this happens to us, many of us, at important points in our life. Sometimes it takes some sort of crisis to provoke this. And so we can find ourselves in the standpoint of skepticism without necessarily having had to go through skeptical philosophy. This is the sort of thing that Camus talks about as, the experience of what he's calling the absurd, coming through just unpredictably. You know, you can't say when it's going to pop up. So Hegel's on to something very, very important and very deep here. He says, the self-consciousness in skepticism does not itself bring these two thoughts of itself together. Both of these are real. Both of these are thoughts of itself, ways in which it's thinking itself. These are not just ideas in its head. Thought is something active. Thought is what counterposed itself to reality over here. Thought is freedom. These are both ways of being free, being what one is. But they seem to have a contradiction. They don't line up with themselves. And this is the fundamental problem. This is the truth of skepticism as Hegel is articulating it. So he gives us some examples here. These are wonderful passages. He says, at one time it recognizes that its freedom lies in rising above all the confusion and contingency of existence. At another time equally admits to a relapse in occupying itself with what is unessential. So, to take a very prosaic example of this, sometimes we're going to read Hegel and think great thoughts and try to wrap our head around the whole dialectic of world history. And then we're going to go have a snack and think, I better check my email, and maybe I'll have a meal now, and I'll watch some Netflix and watch the story. And now what happens after this episode? I should watch that. Wait a second, shouldn't I be reading Hegel? Shouldn't I be thinking these great thoughts? You can't bring the two of them together. You can try. You can tell yourself that by watching some show you're actually doing Hegel, but that's not really true, is it? So, we could come up with all sorts of examples of this as well. Having to go to work, great example of that. So he says, it lets the unessential content in its thinking vanish, but just in doing so is the consciousness of something unessential. There's a back and forth here, right? It affirms the nullity of seeing, hearing, etc., yet it is itself seeing, hearing, and so forth. Here's where it gets really interesting. It affirms the nullity of ethical principles. Why? Because, all ethical principles really are based on something, aren't they? You have to begin with some sort of social norm or some sort of idea. And can't we just question all ideas? Can't we strip them all away? Well, from a skeptical point of view, I suppose that we can. And yet we find ourselves having to live in a certain way. And even the choice to be a skeptic is a certain ethical comportment as well. So he says, it affirms the nullity of ethical principles and lets its conduct be governed by these very principles. And here's where you can think about the typical relativist who says we have to affirm that everything is relative to particular societies or cultures or groups or individuals, and then we should respect them all. Well, why the hell should we respect them all if that's the case? Things are always creeping back in. And it turns out that the reason why we should respect them all is probably not some sort of Kantian thing at work or, Habermasian worry about performative self-contradictions, but more the fact that you have people preaching at you, hey, don't judge. And that's part of contemporary Western society, right? So there's this constant back and forth, the empirical versus the contentless universal. We have content here, but not meaning. We have meaning, but not content. And how do we bring them together? He says, its deeds and its words always belie each other and one another, and equally it has itself the doubly contradictory consciousness of unchangeableness and sameness, and of utter contingency and non-identity with itself. So you can ask yourself, well, where is this contradiction happening? Is this contradiction itself a third part of the consciousness? No, this contradiction is something that the empirical side becomes aware of, and it's also something that the universal side becomes aware of. And that is itself an achievement. Realizing that in the heart of self-consciousness lies a unmasterable, at this point, contradictoriness. So he says, what does it do? It keeps the poles of the contradiction apart from each other. adopts the same attitude to it as it does in its purely negative activity in general. How does it do this? In an inconsistent way. So Hegel talks about this. Point out likeness or identity to it, it will point out unlikeness or non-identity. This is what the skeptic classically would do. You say green, they say red. You say, I think that we should do this policy. They'll say, well, here's why that policy is wrong, and here's why we ought to do that policy instead. This goes all the way back to Pyrrhonian skepticism, where to every argument could be opposed another argument. And the idea is divide and flee. That you preserve your freedom that way. But the question is freedom to what? Freedom to do what? To decide for something or not? And he says, when it is now confronted with what it has just asserted, it turns round and points out likeness or identity. Its talk is, and here's the problem, like the squabbling of self-willed children, like stubborn, bratty kids. One of whom says A if the other says B, and in turn says B if the other says A, and who by contradicting themselves buy for themselves the pleasure of continually contradicting one another. Now, that points to a very important issue. Why would somebody remain within the skeptical perspective? There's really two possibilities. One is what Hegel just talked about. It's fun saying, doing this back and forth sort of thing. But it's only fun for a while. The other possibility would be despair. I can't see a way past this. I can't find a way to bring these two together. Hegel is going to outline for us a development beyond this in the paragraphs to come.